The Senate will come to order. Members, remaining under the order of business of motions and resolutions, I am calling on Senator Dzieck to designate special orders. Senator Dzieck.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pursuant to Rule 26, I designate the following bills to mean special orders for immediate consideration. I don't know if the list is on your desk, but Senator Champion, I believe you have it.
Members, as Senator Dzieck mentioned, on your desk is the special orders list. We're going to start with General Orders number 143, which is House File number 3288. Senator Carlson, this is for claims settlement bill appropriating money. To that point, Senator Carlson for House File 3288.
Thank you, Mr. President. House File 3288 is the annual claims settlement appropriation bill. The Joint House-Senate Subcommittee on Claims was established in 1976 to hear and recommend to the legislature whether or not to pay claims against the state by various persons who cannot proceed against the state under the State Tort Claims Act. The agency, in this case, the Department of Corrections, reviews all claims, and their counsel makes recommendations for immediate settlement, for reimbursement to outside providers, or court-ordered settlements. The resulting recommendations are forwarded to the Subcommittee on Claims to consider and present to the legislature for appropriation. At $1.157 million, the appropriation this year is relatively small compared to prior years. There are 3 exoneration claims, 2 medical reimbursement claims, and 3 work-related injury claims. The claims in the bill were approved by unanimously by the Joint House-Senate Subcommittee on May 4th, 2023. The appropriation this year is I don't believe we have an itemized list, except it's seen in the bill. The Joint House, the current members of the Claims Committee are Senators myself, Carlson, Anderson, and Westland, and Representatives Frederick, Feist, and Quam. With unanimous agreement, the claims bill is submitted for your consideration. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussion on House File 3288? Seeing none, the Secretary will give the bill its 3rd reading.
House File number 3288, a bill for an act relating to claims against the state, providing for the settlement of certain claims.
Any other discussion? 3rd reading. Any other discussion on House File 3288? Seeing none, the Secretary will give the bill its 3rd, listen, I know exactly what it is. Like, okay, is it that I'm having this brain freeze? But no, the Secretary will take the roll on final passes for 3288. Members, please vote. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Zhang votes aye.
Senator Young votes aye.
And Senator Wickland votes aye.
Senator Wickland votes aye. Members, please vote. Senator Jasinski, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson votes aye.
Senator Anderson votes aye. Senator Kroon, are you going to vote? All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 42 ayes and 18 noes. The bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members remaining on special orders, we will now go to number 69 on general orders. That is House File 197. Senator Pappas for a resolution memorializing Congress to resolve that the requirements have been met to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. To that point, Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, I'm bringing before the Senate House File 197, which is a resolution memorializing Congress to resolve that the requirements have been met to ratify the ERA, and it shall be known as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has never been interpreted to guarantee equal rights in the same way as the Equal Rights Amendment will do. Only since 1971 has the 14th Amendment been even applied to sex discrimination. Yet when Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia voted against the Lilly Ledbetter Act, he declared that the U.S. Constitution does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. That is why we need the ERA. Currently, women are too often tracked into jobs that are typically paid less than jobs in industry, which are male-dominated. Roughly 2/3 of minimum wage earners, essential workers, and seniors live below the poverty level are women. That's why we need the ERA. Racial disparities persist. Women make an average of only 82 cents for every dollar that men earned. And in Minnesota, according to the Minnesota Attorney General's recent study, while white women received 18% less wages on average than white men, Asian American women received 25% less wages than white men, African American women received 40% less, and Latinas received 45% less. And women with a master's degree working full-time earn $1,000 less per year than a comparable man with only a bachelor's degree. That's why we need the ERA. We can't be a beacon of light to the world until we address equal justice under law. The ERA spells out equality under the law. Members, I urge you to support this resolution telling Congress to go ahead and publish, the archivist should publish it to declare the ERA as the 38th Amendment to the Constitution.
Any other discussions on House File 197? Senator Nelson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President and members. I have the A1 amendment.
Senator Nelson offers the A1 amendment. The secretary will report the A1 amendment.
Senator Nelson moves to amend House File number 197 as amended pursuant to Rule 45 as follows. Page 1, delete lines 5 to 22. This is the A1 amendment.
Senator Nelson, to your A1 amendment.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President and members. The A1 amendment, actually, members, is the ERA amendment. It's a resolution that I have had before. I will read it to you, and then I will tell you why I think this is necessary. The amendment states, whereas the first and still the only right that the United States Constitution specifically affirms to be equal for women and men is the right to vote under the 19th Amendment, which was ratified by the states in 1920. And whereas Title IX was first passed by Congress as part of the Education Amendments of 1972, which states, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. end of quote, which opened new doors for women and girls in education, including scholarships and athletic participation. Whereas the Equal Right Amendment was first passed by Congress in 1972 and was sent to the states for ratification. And whereas the 1972 federal ERA sought to guarantee, in quotes, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. End quote. And whereas the Minnesota ratified the original ERA in 1973, and whereas the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States has never been interpreted to protect against sex discrimination in the same way that a federal ERA would. And whereas a federal ERA would clarify the legal status of women in cases of sex discrimination for courts across the country. And whereas the number of women who serve their families as primary breadwinners has risen over the past 5 decades. And whereas more women than men are enrolled in higher education institutions and complete their degrees, and many women regularly pursue advanced degrees. And whereas women have reached new political heights in the past 50 years, including United States Vice President, United States Secretary of State, United States Ambassador, United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Chair of the United States Federal Reserve, and numerous elected officials right here in Minnesota and across the country. And whereas the adoption of a federal ERA would recognize the extraordinary progress that women have made in a variety of fields since 1972, including but not limited to math and sciences, statistics, auditing, banking, finance, practice of medicine, surgery, medical research, pharmacy, mental health, engineering, architecture, construction and building trades, real estate, business management, entrepreneurship, law enforcement, judicial and legal scholarship, practice of law, public relations, advertising, communications, writing, editing, publishing, veterinary practice, agriculture sciences, aeronautics, and astronautics. And whereas women-owned businesses were less than 5% nationwide prior to the 1970s, but now are approximately 40% of all businesses, and that's according to the U.S. Census Bureau and IRS data. And whereas the past 50 years have granted women and girls more opportunity than ever before in the history of the United States. And whereas the future for women and girls in Minnesota is bright, and all of Minnesota's daughters can be hopeful as we work towards further improvement. And whereas all federal and state laws should apply equally for the benefit of women and girls, particularly those regarding employment. And whereas all application of federal and state laws should render equal justice for all women and girls throughout the various stages of their lives, from the beginning of life until death. And now, therefore, be it resolved by the legislature of the state of Minnesota that it condemns illegal discriminatory practices concerning hiring and promoting women and girls. And be it further resolved by the legislature of the state of Minnesota that it condemns illegal pay discrimination against women and girls. Be it further resolved by the legislature of the state of Minnesota that it condemns sex trafficking and exploitation of women and girls. And be it further resolved by the legislature of the state of Minnesota that it condemns violence against women and girls. And be it further resolved by the legislature of the state of Minnesota that it urges the Congress of the United States to move forward with a federal ERA affirming the equality and dignity of the sexes, incorporating the principles of this resolution. And be it further resolved that the Secretary of the State of Minnesota is directed to prepare copies of this memorial and transmit them to the President of the United States, the President and Secretary of the United States Senate, the Speaker and the Clerk of the United States House of Representatives, and the members of the United States Congress. Members, I encourage a yes vote on this resolution, which will instruct Congress to begin the process of the ERA amendment so that it can be ratified again by the state of Minnesota, and we hope the remaining 34 or 35 additional states that are needed. I will stand for any questions, and I ask for a roll call.
Roll call. Requested roll call granted. Senator Housley.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Nelson, for bringing this amendment forward. Since the introduction of the Federal Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, women have increased their representation in the political sphere. Nearly half of them have college degrees and are a considerable percentage in the workforce. This all was done without an amendment. Demonstrates that the current Constitution does have the needed protections, but to put an exclamation point on women's rights, this amendment does just that. Like you said, Senator Nelson, this amendment condemns illegal discriminatory practices concerning hiring and promoting women and girls. It condemns illegal pay discrimination against women and girls, and it condemns sex trafficking and exploitation of women and girls, and also condemns violence against women and girls. So, Senator Nelson, I also encourage a green vote on your Senate files amendment to Senate File 47. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Pappas to the A1 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you so much, Senator Nelson, Senator Housley, for your resounding support for women's rights. And I regret that you didn't come and work with me so that we could have incorporated more of your language into my amendment. But I do have one concern, is it's not clear to me if this is an amendment that we should start over with the ERA amendment. So would Senator Nelson yield?
Senator Nelson, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Pappas.
Senator Nelson, is it your intention that even though we have the number of states that have ratified the amendment, that you think we need to start over and ask all the states to ratify again?
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Senator Pappas. Thank you for asking that question. That is a very good question, and it's a very important question. And I will tell you my rationale on this actually comes from one of our feminine icons, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who specifically, you might recall, in 2020, was asked this very question. And her response resonates with me. And that is that while many of us are disappointed that the ERA was not ratified within the required timeline that started back in 1972, the question I think that you are asking me, Senator Pappas, is should we continue to add one more state or additional states? Or should the clock start over? And I do take my counsel from RBG, who specifically said that we need to start over. We need a clean start, because what's happened in the last few decades is that some states have ratified after the deadline to ratify. Some states have withdrawn their ratification. So it is my contention that if we want to have our Congress and we want to have an opportunity to vote on an ERA amendment, we must start again, as the former Supreme Court Justice stated. And so that is the intention. We must be crystal clear with Congress. Minnesota, which has already adopted, which already ratified, way back in, I think, 72 or 73, ratified the ERA amendment to our U.S. Constitution. And I have no doubt that we could do so again. But this is such an important issue. We cannot let this flounder in the uncertainty about, well, what about the states that ratified after the deadline? Do those count? Or what about the states that removed their ratification? Do we have to subtract those? So, Senator Pappas, I am committed to this, and I believe that we must allow, just as Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, the clock needs to start over, and we must pass this resolution to Congress asking that they start the process now.
Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do have several concerns about this amendment. First of all, I don't really see anything in here that calls for a constitutional amendment, which my resolution does. I can certainly argue with you about arbitrary deadlines that were not really appropriate, and certainly the opportunity to rescind ratifications is also not really allowed. But since we had the pleasure of hearing your amended version of my bill, and I just summarized mine, I think I should really enlighten the members by reading the resolution. Whereas the Equal Rights Amendment was first passed by Congress in 1972 and was sent to the states for ratification. Whereas the ERA guarantees equality of rights under the law and shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And whereas the adoption of the ERA will help to advance gender justice for women, girls, and gender-expansive individuals. And whereas the ERA authorizes Congress to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of the ERA. And whereas the ERA states that the amendment will take effect 2 years after the last constitutionally necessary state ratification occurs. And whereas on January 27th, 2020, Virginia became the 38th and final state needed to ratify the ERA, which has been ratified, therefore, by the necessary 3/4 of states. And whereas the Archivist of the United States performs a statutory and ministerial role with respect to certifying the ratification of amendments to the United States Constitution. And whereas as of this date, the Archivist has not certified the amendment. And whereas no time limit exists within the text of the proposed amendment that was ratified by more than 3/4 of the states, and whereas women, girls, and gender-expansive people across the country are experiencing declining access to health, wealth, and opportunity, and increasing incidences of poverty and violence. And whereas the ERA was first written by Alice Paul, the head of the National Women's Party, in order to guarantee the rights affirmed by the United States Constitution are held equally by all citizens without regard to sex. And whereas the ERA would provide a fundamental legal remedy against sex discrimination, and whereas the ERA would clarify the legal status of sex discrimination for the courts, where decisions still inconsistently deal with such claims, and whereas Minnesota ratified the ERA in 1973, and whereas the first and still the only right that the United States Constitution specifically affirms to be equal for women and men is the right to vote under the 19th Amendment, which was ratified by the states in 1920. Whereas the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States has never been interpreted to protect against sex discrimination in the same way that the ERA would. And whereas in September 2010, the Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said he did not believe that the United States Constitution, specifically the 14th Amendment, protects against sex discrimination. And whereas the ERA has been ratified in 12 states, including Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Utah. And whereas in 1868, the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution despite 2 states purporting to rescind their ratification. And whereas the state constitution of 27 states, including Alaska, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming, provide either inclusive or partial guarantees of equal rights on the basis of sex. And whereas without the addition of the ERA to the United States Constitution, legislation and case law has resulted in extraordinary progress for women, and it has the potential to be ignored, weakened, or reversed. Congress can amend or repeal legislation advancing equality with a simple majority vote. The presidential administration can weakly enforce these laws, and the United States Supreme Court can continue to use intermediate scrutiny when reviewing cases concerning gender. And whereas it is vital that the constitutional gender equality rights be upheld now, that the ERA has been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, whereas the Archivist of the United States has a statutory ministerial duty to certify that a proposed amendment to the Constitution is valid and has become part of the Constitution once it is ratified by more than 3/4 of the states. Whereas Section 3 of the Equal Rights Amendment states that the amendment shall take effect 2 years after the last constitutionally necessary state ratification occurs, which was January 27, 2020. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the legislature of the state of Minnesota that it urges the Congress of the United States to pass House Resolution 25 and Senate Resolution 4, resolving that the requirements have been met to ratify the ERA and that shall now be known as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Be it further resolved that the Secretary of the State of Minnesota is directed to prepare copies of this memorial and transmit them to the President of the United States, the President and Secretary of the United States Senate, the Speaker and the Clerk of the United States House of Representatives, and the members of the United States Congress. That is a resolution to Congress to certify the ERA.
Senator Nelson to the A1 amendment.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President and Senator Pappas. I did want to, there are new members in the body. I have offered the ERA resolution before and brought it again today. And what I hope the members notice is there is a significant difference in the A1 amendment and in Senator Pappas's amendment or resolution. The challenge, members, is that currently, if I understand Senator Pappas correctly, she believes that just adding Minnesota as ratifying this amendment again, which, by the way, we ratified in 1972, would be sufficient. But those far wiser than many of us, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was very clear that that would be extremely problematic. Because, yes, does Virginia count or not? It ratified after the deadline, okay? But the deadline passed. And Senator Pappas's resolution does not address that. In addition, Senator Pappas's resolution doesn't take account of the states that have withdrawn their ratification. So, members, if you're serious about asking Congress, passing a resolution, asking Congress to ratify the ERA amendment, and this is the language of the original ERA amendment is included here, I believe the only recourse is to vote green today, and I encourage a green vote.
Senator Pappas, any guidance on the A1? Oh, Senator Housley, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I have to agree with Senator Nelson because Congress is allowed to do whatever it wants to do regardless of this resolution. And for those folks watching at home that don't know the difference between putting something into law and a resolution is just stating, here's what we think in Minnesota. And going back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she said she'd like to start it over and going back to the Virginia ratifying long past the deadline. The only legal way to add the ERA to the Constitution now is to introduce it anew. We have plenty of time between now and session ending, Senator Pappas, to maybe between bonding negotiations, we can sit down and we can talk about going back and forth on our two different ERA amendments. Minnesota's been a trailblazer with all of these different bills that we've been passing this year. So let's really sit down and go over the A1 Senator Nelson amendment and your Senate File 47 to really get this right for what Minnesota's opinion is going to be on the Equal Rights Amendment. So I encourage a green vote. Thank you.
Members, any other questions on the A1 amendment? A roll call was requested and a roll call granted. The last word would be that of the author of the A1, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will leave you with the direct quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg in a Georgetown interview on 2020 to the very point of the difference between the A1, why I believe you should vote for the A1 today. I quote, "I would like to see a new beginning. I'd like to start over. There is too much controversy about a latecomer like Virginia ratifying long after the deadline passed. Plus, a number of states have withdrawn their ratification. So if you count a latecomer on the plus side, does that mean that you need to disregard the votes of those states that have changed their minds? Members, logic is clear. This amendment, the A1 amendment, is the resolution that should be supported today if we are to seriously move this forward in Congress. Again, I encourage a green vote.
The Secretary will give the A1 amendment. The Secretary, all will vote. Let me just put it that way. I am tired today. Yeah, roll call was granted, and we will now vote. I am tired. I did. I pushed it. You know I did. Huh? I did do it. That is why he was like, oh. Members, please vote. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Zhang votes no.
Senator Zhang votes no. Senator Jasinski, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson votes aye.
Senator Anderson votes aye. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also report that Senator Mann votes no.
Senator Mann votes no. She said to and rest. Oh, let's see. Jason? Is anyone else? All senators having voted who desire to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 32 ayes and 34 noes, the A1 amendment is not adopted. We are now still on the underlining bill. Any other discussions? The secretary will give the bill its third reading.
House File Number 197, a resolution memorializing Congress to resolve that the requirements have been met to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and that it shall now be known as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution.
Third reading. Any other discussions? Seeing none, the secretary will take the final roll on House File 197. Members, please vote. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Mann votes aye.
And Senator Zhang votes aye.
Senator Zhang votes aye. Senator Jasinski, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Mr. President, Senator Anderson votes no.
Senator Anderson votes no. Members, I'm waiting because we have a couple people still on their way to vote. All senators having voted that desired to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 42 ayes and 25 nays. The bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members still on special orders. We now go to Senate file number 35, which is Kunesh, for a constitutional amendment providing for equality under the law. It is number 68 on general orders. To that end, Senator Kunesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm very excited to bring this bill to you and bring it to the floor of the Senate. This is a bill that I passed off of the House floor when I was a state representative, and I am more than honored to do it here on the Senate floor as well. This bill proposes a state constitutional amendment to codify the right of equality and to read as follows, possibly in our state constitution. Equality under the law shall not be abridged or denied by this state or any of its cities, counties, or other political subdivisions on account of race, color, creed, sexual orientation, sex, gender identity or expression, age, disability, ancestry, or national origin. This proposed amendment would be submitted to the voters. So this will be a way for the voters of Minnesota to decide if they want to have a statement of equal rights in our state constitution. We're not doing that here today, but we are merely giving the permission for this statement to be added to the ballot in 2024 for the people of Minnesota to decide. So this statement would be submitted to those voters on the 2024 state general election, and then it would be, if ratified, would take effect January 1st, 2025. Members, we know that our Minnesota Constitution that was written over 165 years ago, before the Civil War time, at a time that the gendered language that was used throughout our Constitution applied only to the majority of white landowning men. It is well past that time to update it and to reflect our 21st century values. This new Equal Rights Amendment, commonly known as the ERA, will provide a standard in our state courts. We know that racial disparities persist. As much as we like to say they don't, we see it every day. In fact, there was a sixth mosque that was just vandalized here in St. Paul, not in just the last few days. We also know that the disparities for women, especially when it comes to earning ability, continues. And just as Senator Pappas mentioned, women still only make an average of 82 cents for every dollar that men earn. And in Minnesota, according to the Minnesota Attorney General's recent report to the legislature, our Native women are paid only 51% of what non-Hispanic white men were paid. White women receive 18% less wages than an average white man. Asian American women receive 25% less wages than a white man, and African American women receive 40% less than those of her counterparts. This is how the continual disparities in home ownership, in generational wealth, in the ability for quality daycare, in the ability to support families continues to persist. If the ERA, enshrined in Minnesota's Constitution, happens, it will prohibit laws and policies based on these historical stereotypes. This ERA will provide the constitutional basis that gives persons, every person, who are victimized by gender-based violence, legal recourse in our courts. We have a number of veterans in our caucus here, and we know that our women veterans and our women active duty members fight and die for our country, but they still don't have equal rights. Too often, our courts turn a blind eye to the violence, to the rape and the sexual violence of women especially, and Minnesota has historically had a high occurrence of sex trafficking. These constitutional rights that the ERA would enshrine will allow for strong legal recourse. Our state must lay those legal frameworks to protect anyone and everyone against violence, against rape, and to ensure that those individuals who are survivors are not blamed for the assaults. That's why we need a state ERA. Most Americans believe we should have equal rights. Most Minnesotans believe we should have equal rights, and equality is long overdue. We have the moral imperative right here today, right now, to remedy this glaring omission. So I invite you all to join me in voting yes for the Equality Ballot Initiative and allow Minnesotans the transparency and the ability to decide and to add an equal rights for all in our state constitution. And Mr. President, I ask for a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Any other discussion on Senate file number 37? Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I appreciate your indulgence. This bill did not come before any of the committees that I was involved in, so I wonder if the bill's author would yield for a question.
You want to speak to Senator Kunesh?
Yes.
Senator Kunesh, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is, I'm wondering if you could clarify how this bill would interact with Title IX, a federal bill that has been so instrumental in ensuring women have equal access to sports opportunities.
Senator Kunesh, to the question.
Mr. President, this bill will also enshrine those rights of women who are participating in athletics and sports teams just as much as anybody else.
Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would she yield for another question?
Senator Kunesh, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. So in particular, I'd like to know how you see this interacting with folks who are born biologically male competing in women's sports.
Senator Kunesh, to the question.
Mr. President and members, those that are participating in the specific sports that they themselves identify will still have that opportunity to do so.
Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. I suspected that would be the answer. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about my daughter. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and she has some confidence issues. She's a bit of a perfectionist, doesn't like to do anything unless she can do it perfectly well. And last year in 7th grade, she started running cross country. And by the end of the season in cross country, she actually, as a 7th grader, was able to qualify for the state meet and was able to go down last year and this year and run state cross country. She's in track this year. To be at the top of her sport at that age, she runs the 5K in about 21 minutes. An average biological male can run the same race in about 19 minutes. Now, I say average because if you look at 90 runners that are the same age as my daughter, around number 45 finishes the race at about 19 minutes a mile. So, Mr. President, what we are doing with some of the language in this bill is we are saying that my daughter, who runs really fast for a, at the time, 13, now 14-year-old female, should be competing against biological males who are sort of average at their sports. And I think that sets us back, Mr. President. I think that sets the purpose of Title IX back. And we're telling our daughters that they should have to compete and expect that they're never going to be able to win in the sport that they are competing in. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussion on Senate File 37? Senator Nelson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. I just want to share a little bit regarding Title IX. I believe that is one of the concerns that was brought up regarding and how this particular, perhaps well-intended constitutional amendment might affect Title IX in girls' sports. Well, I was the first class of girls that was able to participate in athletics in my high school. After Title IX, certainly the first thing that came around, I was able to participate in girls' track and girls' cross country, and how important those opportunities were. And I believe Senator Farnsworth brought up a good point about the differences in times between biological men and women. And first, let's just be clear. We all agree, Minnesotans, we all agree on equal rights for women and girls, and we all want to oppose discrimination in society. But that doesn't mean that this particular constitutional amendment is what we need to achieve our goal. Minnesota currently has considerable legal protections for those who may face discrimination in their lives, most prominently in our Minnesota Human Rights Act. And the use of terms like gender expression or identity, in addition to sex, could actually undermine efforts to have women-specific programs or services, including like women's shelters, business development programs. I helped get that language in, that we would know how much of our investor credit, our angel investor credit would go to women. Those are things that we want to encourage in, and we want to encourage and support women-owned businesses. And of course we want to protect Title IX protection, not just for the senator's daughter, but for all of your daughters and your granddaughters. And the amendment draft does not do that. So there are concerns regarding how gender expression would impact Title IX sports. And I think that's something that we need to wrestle with seriously. I have seen in my lifetime how valuable it is for those women who, like me, had the opportunity to participate in women's sports. It brings great, great advantages and development and confidence. And what would that look like if our girls, our Minnesota girls, were competing with biological boys? We know science, and we know there are biological differences. And that is not to disrespect anyone's decision about how they feel about their gender. But we must protect the right of Minnesota women and girls to participate freely in women's sports. And I am cautious and concerned that this particular bill will not allow for that. And I think that is problematic. I think it's problematic for all of Minnesota women and girls. And I would encourage a no vote.
Any additional discussion on Senate File 37? Senator Maye Quade.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I am so excited that I get to be the bearer of super exciting news. Minnesota has been trans-inclusive in our sports through E12 for over a decade. Minnesota and the United States has been trans-inclusive in the NCAA and in the world and the International Olympic Committee for a very long time. Title IX is not about sports. Title IX is about discrimination on the basis of sex in schools. Federal courts have upheld that discrimination on the basis of sex includes discrimination against transgender people. Trans girls are girls. In fact, Mr. President, since Minnesota has become trans-inclusive in sports, again, like a decade ago, we have seen girls' participation rates in sports improve. We have some of the highest, if not the highest, girls' participation rates in the country, in part because students know that if some students get discriminated against, it's likely that others are going to get discriminated against. And when we remove that discrimination, they are free to participate. So using trans people as a shield, as a some sort of faux concern about what will be, Title IX, the Minnesota Constitution, the Minnesota Human Rights Act, all protect trans people from the heinous rhetoric that would be perpetrated on them if the majorities were different. But I can assure members in this chamber that the Equal Rights Amendment is a tool to be used in courts when there is alleged discrimination. Nothing changes the day that Minnesota voters, if they do approve this measure, it goes into our Constitution, and then someday a court will interpret how does this amendment apply to this specific case, and case law will be developed over and over and over again. That is how constitutional amendments work. So, this constitutional amendment does not violate Title IX because the world that people are fearing already exists. Senator Farnsworth's daughter already exists in a world where trans girls play sports. We already exist in a world where trans women play sports, and the world has not fallen. We are better for it. So, I am so excited to be voting green on this bill. I thank Senator Kunesh and the myriad of women who have come before me. We stand on their shoulders today because they have been moving this for decades, and I'm so grateful for their work, and I'm so excited to be voting green to get this over the line. Thank you.
Senator Westland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would echo some of what Senator Maye Quade has said and a few other things, but I guess I would like to ask Senator Farnsworth if he would yield for a question.
Senator Farnsworth, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Westland.
Senator Farnsworth, do you know how many transgender kids participate in sports in Minnesota?
Senator Farnsworth.
Nope.
Senator Westland.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. So, in 2017, there was a study that found that about 3% of Minnesota high school students identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. And what they found is that only about 12% of transgender girls and about 14% of transgender boys play organized sports compared to 68% of all other youth. And what is true about sports, Mr. President and members, is that transgender youth participate in sports for exactly the same reason as every other kid does. They participate because they love the activity, they love the sport, they want to be included, they want to have the benefit of physical and mental health, and developed sense of teamwork and discipline. And the thing is, transgender youth are just no different than any other kid who wants to play sports. And what we know is this has been the case in Minnesota now for, as Senator Maye Quade indicated, this has been a policy in Minnesota for over 10 years now. This bill, this ERA amendment, just to come back to the reality, is about banning discrimination. And no kid, especially no kid, should face discrimination because they want to play a sport. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members, I'm just expanding a little bit on or adding a little bit to what my good friend Senator Maye Quade just shared with all of us. Very simply put, transgender boys and men are boys and men. They're not something biological with a descriptor attached after them. Transgender girls and women are women and girls. But Mr. President, what I really want to visit about is that I fear the effect of this debate I fear that it will create an unfounded sense of unfairness and resentment on the part of some Minnesotans, feeling like someone is doing something that encroaches on them and is unfair to them, when that is not the case at all, not proven in any way, shape, or form, partially supported by the arguments that Senator Westland made. We're talking about a de minimis number of people, but also shown by science that men and women are men and women, whether they're transgender or not. Please avail yourself of the medicine and the science and the facts before you stand up and say things like this. But I mostly fear, Mr. President, that when arguments are made against the right of girls and boys and men and women to be who they are in every realm and endeavor as fully human, whether that be moving around in public, relieving themselves in public facilities, participating in sports and other enrichment and development activities, finding information about themselves so they can learn about themselves, having discussions with trusted adults, being able to dress as who they are and be referred to by the pronouns that are consistent with who they are as human beings, as fully human beings with dignity. I fear, Mr. President, that the effect would be to further marginalize, create resentment, and create scapegoating. I'm not questioning anyone's motives here. I think everyone in this chamber is good and of good heart and goodwill. But I'm here to tell you that something is happening in this country. This debate is much larger than what's going on here right now in this chamber on this particular amendment. I just had the pleasure of meeting State Representative Zoe Zephyr out in the hallway, who was kicked out of her own chamber for speaking her own truth. She's a hero and to be commended, and I'm extremely honored to have met her. But Mr. President, this debate speaks exactly to the reason we need this constitutional amendment, and I'm so grateful to Senator Kunesh for bringing this forward, because it points exactly to why we need the people, the good people of the state of Minnesota, to be a part of this conversation. Listen to what you're saying when you're speaking out against this amendment. You're saying that the people of Minnesota don't have the right to be a part of this conversation and stand up and say that some things are so fundamental, being human, being a citizen, being someone who lives in this state, means that they get to enjoy the full equality and protection of the law that shall not be abridged. And you're saying we can't even ask the people of Minnesota. And what it amounts to, what I fear the message received by my community, the LGBTQ community, is we're not worthy. We're not fully human. We're not full citizens. That's what I hear. May not be what you're saying, but that's the effect. And that's what I hear when we hear these arguments that are not supported by evidence at all. When we talk about being able to participate in economic activities, people who aren't women, they are women. People participating in sports, people going to school. I beg you, as I did when we had the debate on conversion therapy, spend time with young transgender people and their families. Go to the Transforming Families picnic that I talked about. It is a beautiful experience. And you will no longer run around and say things like biological boys and biological girls. And you'll no longer question the authenticity and the dignity of human beings, if you have. I'm not saying you have. But when you say it, that's how we feel. Please educate yourself and spend time with real human beings. Make that human connection. You will understand. And you will understand the need for everyone to be reflected in the foundational document that guarantees our full rights as human beings in this state. Thank you, Mr. President.
Members, any other discussion on Senate File 37? Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Thank you, Senator Kunesh, for bringing this forward. Members, I, of course, support women having full and equal rights. I wouldn't be standing before you today had my mother not elbowed her way into tables that didn't make room for her, had my grandmother not broke societal norms and been a working mother in the 50s. This bill didn't come before me in any committees, and so hearing some concerns, I just wanted to see if Senator Kunesh would yield to a brief question. Mr. President.
I'm sorry, Senator Coleman.
No problem. I was just wondering if Senator Kunesh would yield for a question.
Senator Kunesh? Senator Kunesh, will you yield for a question? She will yield for a question. Senator Coleman, and I'll wait here until she yields, okay?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Kunesh. I think one of the concerns that's been brought up in conversations is maybe an unintended consequence this might have on the religious community, particularly faiths or denominations where men are the only ones able to be head of those churches or of those faith communities. Would this bill, if it goes onto the ballot and it passes, would this unintended consequence or one of them be forcing, say, the Catholic Church to have women be priests? Could you, and if that's not the case, could you shed a little bit of light on what the impacts of this will be?
Senator Kunesh, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do believe that there is still the freedom for our religious sects to create and continue to organize their hierarchy as they have continued, and if they so choose to allow women to become ordained or take a more active role in the religious practices, then that would be up to the religious sect.
Senator Coleman. Any other discussions on Senate File 37? Seeing none, the Secretary will give Senate File 37 its third reading.
Senate File number 37, a bill for an act relating to state government, proposing an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution, Article 1, by adding a section.
Third reading. Third reading. Any additional discussions on Senate File 37? Seeing none, you certainly asked me. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know we're low on sleep right now, so it's easy to forget.
I did forget there, Senator Johnson.
So I wanted to bring up one brief part in this particular amendment that I do have some questions about, and I just want to see if I can get a little bit of clarity on here. Throughout Minnesota the statute, and in particular the Minnesota Human Rights Act, one word that continues to come up in phrases similar to what we're seeing in today's Senate File 37 is a protection that specifically calls out religion. In here we see different categories of protection, everything from age and gender and sexual orientation, race, creed, but in no place within today's bill do we see religion being called out specifically. And so I'm just wondering if Senator Kunesh would have a moment to yield and maybe give the body some clarity on what the difference is between creed and religion.
Senator Kunesh, did you hear the question? Senator Kunesh, to the question.
So in the bill or the statement that we would like to have inserted in our constitutional amendment, we do use the word creed. And creed is not an unusual word. It is very closely, but not exactly synonymous to religion. Creed actually is the set of beliefs or aims that guide somebody's actions. It is a system of Christian or other religious beliefs. And a creed is often like the Nicene Creed that I grew up with. It's a statement of basic beliefs and religious faith, and it's the guiding principles that a person might have that might address their spirituality, their religious practices or beliefs. And so it's a word that I feel works a little bit better than just religion, because not everybody considers that they practice a religion. Maybe they have a different spiritual sense of the world. And so creed would allow for that broad interception and ability to practice their own beliefs the way that they feel best suits them.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we went through this exercise in the Rules Committee when we first saw this as well. And I understand what Senator Kunesh is saying, but I think what she is describing is the exact opposite of the effect that we're going to have here. Underneath, let's say, Christian religion, you brought up the Nicene Creed. There's also the Apostles' Creed. There's other creeds within that as well, which is under the heading of the religion. So if you want to talk about a religion, whether it's Buddhism or if you're a Muslim or if you're a Christian or if you're an atheist, whatever, that's your ism, that's your religion, right? But then how you operate within that religion is your creed, right? Kind of your basic operating plan within that as well. So when you say that a creed is broad enough to cover everything, I think we miss the point on we're not being general enough to protect the religious practices of Minnesotans across the state. Now, unfortunately, I did not have Democrat support on the amendment I was going to bring up during second reading, so I didn't want to waste the body's time on bringing that up. However, I think it is critical in this particular piece that religion is recognized. The more we get away from those overarching beliefs that Minnesotans have, the less protections Minnesotans are going to have for their practices. Regardless of their creed, let's ensure that Minnesotans and their religious practices are protected. And secondly, simply to line up with Minnesota law. If you look throughout the statute in Minnesota, you're going to consistently see religion called out as a protected class. So this confuses the language. It makes a twist in what we currently have and how we currently practice our statute writing. I'm very, very disappointed to see that that was not recognized in this particular bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussion on Senate File 37? Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to bring us back to what we're doing here today, which is making sure that people are treated with equality in the state of Minnesota. And this is going on the ballot. So the Minnesotans are still going to decide the outcome of this and hopefully support it. But my dear seatmate, Senator Kunesh, asked me to get up and say a couple words, and I would do anything for her. So she had asked me when she was writing her opening speech if it was accurate to say that women in the military still face some stuff. And I said that is absolutely 100% accurate. And so I just wanted to say a few things that are still going on to women today in various contexts. When I went from enlisted to officer, my commander at the time literally told me, because we were in the Air Force, but the Army doesn't do its own weather, so we did weather for both. Well, I don't think the Army would respect a female officer, so you don't get promoted. There was one time we were jogging in the woods, or the men had gone jogging in the woods at Camp Ripley in central Minnesota, and I said, "Oh, where's that jogging trail? I would like to go." And my officer told me, "You can't go jogging because you could get assaulted, and I don't want to do that paperwork." Not, "I'm actually concerned you might get assaulted," or "we have a problem. I don't want to do that paperwork if something happens to you." When I was in the Hurricane Hunters, you had to get check rides. And one of the men giving check rides would be so hard on the new females coming into the job that
his goal was to make them cry because he point blank said he didn't think women should be in the military. I could go on, but these things happen not just in the military, but also in civilian life as well. And one of the things that we also always talked about in the military when we were talking about thinking about equity in everyday life was that oftentimes women, even of higher ranks, people tend to use their first names instead of properly using their rank when they would always use the rank for the men. And I will say that's something that I've always carried with me and something I have even noticed here in the Senate. That a lot of times women are she, her, this, that. I even know of a case here where a woman in conference committee, a female senator, was referred to by her first name. Now, pulling back the curtain a little bit, we call each other by our first names outside of the body. But the fact that women, even here, often aren't given that same respect of title, that same respect of deference, shows the exact reason that we need to still be mindful of this issue and working on it today. So I am happy to support my seatmate. I am happy to support all the people here today who have been working on this so long, and I will be happy to vote green.
Senator Nelson. Senator Maye Quade.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm so excited to vote for this. Enshrining the basic principle of gender equity into the Constitution would make it clear that Minnesotans expect our courts to apply a very high level of scrutiny to laws that create or reinforce disparities. And it would make it clear that such laws are justified or need to be justified by a compelling state interest. You might be aware, Mr. President, there's no explicit right to gender equity in the state or federal constitution, with the exception of the hard-fought right to vote, which actually didn't include all women. So 1965 was when all women were given the right to vote. So 57 years, we've all been able to vote. Because of this, Supreme Court Justice Scalia said, certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of gender. The only question is whether it prohibits it. It does not. Nobody ever thought that's what it's meant. Nobody ever voted for that. So if current society wants to outlaw discrimination by gender, hey, we have a thing called legislatures. Well, members, we're the legislature, and we get to enshrine this, or give it to Minnesotans to enshrine this in the Constitution. This would put gender equity on the same footing as racial and religious equity. At present, the federal standard under intermediate scrutiny, the government's interest to justify gender-based disparity only has to be important. The ERA here in Minnesota would create a backdrop to a hodgepodge of anti-discrimination laws that we have in our state. And this is so important because the legislature would have clear guidance on future legislation and a mandate from our citizenry. This would be a tool for advocates to attack the remaining manifestations of inequality in our state, of which there are many, and they are profound. So no one can say exactly what's going to happen, Mr. President, when we pass this. The citizens of Minnesota are going to have to vote on this. It would have to be adopted in our Constitution. But I can say with assuredness that even after that happens, if it does, the effects would not be immediate. They will be incremental, and they will happen as a result of legal challenges. And those legal challenges would invoke a very deliberative, sometimes very long process of evaluation that's governed by the rules of evidence and procedure in court. Our Constitution is a living, breathing document. It is not done until we enumerate specifically the rights of our citizenry. And amendments to our Constitution, state or federal, do not fix the things immediately, but they are a beacon to our future, to future generations like my daughter. So proof of idealism that allows these values and principles to take root and grow. And when we have places like this, we know that the work is not done. And so, members, our work is not done, but today we take a huge step forward to enshrine equity into our Constitution, and I really look forward to seeing a green vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any further discussions on Senate File 37? Seeing none, the Secretary will take the roll on final passage of Senate File 37. Members, please vote. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Mann votes aye.
Say it again.
Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Mann votes aye.
And Senator Zhang votes aye.
Senator Zhang votes aye.
Mr. President,
Senator Jasinski, those voting under Rule 40.7.
Senator Anderson votes no.
Senator Anderson votes no. Members, please vote. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also report that Senator Dietzick votes aye.
Senator Dietzick votes aye. Members, just as a gentle reminder, when we're voting, you're only supposed to be at the members at your desk. Members, you have to be at your desk. That includes staff is not supposed to be at a member's desk when we're voting. And this is a good time to remind us, even when our friends come over from the house, they're not supposed to sit at your desk, especially when we're voting. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also report that Senator Wickland votes aye.
Senator Wickland votes aye. Members, we're waiting a little bit because some folks are in a conference committee, and I'm giving them more time or ample time to make it to the chambers. So thank you for your patience. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 43 ayes and 23 noes. The bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members remaining under the order of business of motions and resolutions, we will revert to the third order of business. Messages from the House. The secretary will read the message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce that the House has adopted the recommendation and report of the Conference Committee on House File Number 1370 and repassed said bill in accordance with the report of the committee, so adopted. House File Number 1370, a bill for an act relating to public safety, establishing a cause of action for non-consensual dissemination of deepfake sexual images. House File Number 1370 is herewith transmitted to the Senate. Signed, Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Maye Quade for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and Conference Committee report on House File 1370 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee.
Senator Maye Quade moved that the foregoing recommendations and Conference Committee report on House File 1370 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee. Senator Maye Quade to that motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this is the deepfake bill that we voted on. It is coming back to you almost identically. I can say that the Senate position remained very strong in Conference Committee and the slight details that did exist, with one exception to address the one no vote that we had in this chamber. We upped the civil penalty from $10,000 to $100,000. So, Mr. President, I hope to earn a totally green board today, and I urge members to adopt this Conference Committee report.
Senator Lucero.
Mr. President, I would encourage members to also support this conference report with a green vote.
Any other discussion on adoption of the committee report? All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails and the committee report is adopted. The secretary will give the bill its third reading.
House File Number 1370, a bill for an act relating to public safety, establishing a cause of action for non-consensual dissemination of deepfake sexual images.
Third reading. Now, Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I am excited about this report. I wanted to, or bill, I should say. I want to thank Senator Maye Quade for her leadership on this issue. I very much appreciated having somebody who understands this issue, the threat to all Minnesota and all Minnesotans on this, and this is an example of how Republicans, Democrats can work together on something that is a common interest and in the common good of all people. And again, this is a very important bill. We've debated it in the past. I won't rehash everything here, but I encourage all members to support with a green vote. Thank you.
Any other discussion on House File 1370? Senator Maye Quade, last words before we vote.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I urge a green vote, and I do just want to note that this was an incredibly wonderful process to go through. I want to thank all of my co-authors. I want to thank my Conference Committee members, and let's go show Minnesotans how seriously we take this. Thank you.
The Secretary will take the roll on final passage of House File 1370. That was for you. Senator Bowden, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Dietzick votes aye.
Senator Dietzick votes aye.
Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Wickland votes aye.
Senator Wickland votes aye.
And Senator Zhang votes aye.
And Senator Young votes aye. Senator Jasinski, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson votes aye.
Senator Anderson votes aye. Members, thank you for your patience. I'm waiting for a couple others to come. And then we'll do these. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 66 ayes and 1 no. The bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members remaining under motions and resolutions, one author motion to read. The secretary will read the motion.
Senator McEwen moves that her name be stricken as chief author and shown as a co-author, and the name of Senator Murphy be added as the chief author to Senate File Number 1384.
Members, we will adopt the author's motion as one. All in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. Senator Bowden for motion to recess.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do make a motion to recess to the call of the president. Members, keep an eye on your emails. We will communicate about at least a 30 minutes notice for a time when we reconvene.
Any discussion on that,
Mr. President.
Senator Johnson?
Thank you. And would Senator Bolden yield, please?
Senator Bowden will yield. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just Senator Bolden, just wanted to kind of figure out what's in the air right now. What could we possibly be seeing this afternoon or later this evening?
Senator Bowden, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was a bit of distraction, so if I heard the question correctly, it's sort of, what's going to happen the next time frame here. So we need to get in communication with Majority Leader Disick, who has been, in negotiations and communications with the governor, and to see, have things come over from the House. As we know, things are fluid right now as we wrap up session, so we will put pieces together and be in communication for what will happen, throughout the rest of the day.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Senator Bolden, if she would yield for another question.
Senator Bolden, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Johnson.
So in communication, will you be sending out an email that outlines a little bit about what this evening is going to look like? Is that what you mean by communication?
Senator Bolden.
Thank you, Mr. President. We will be sending out an email in terms of when we will be reconvening this evening, and more will be shared as we have more information about the plan.
Senator Johnson.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Seeing no further discussions on the motion to recess, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Senate is now in recess. To the call of the President.